So with Nighthold about a week and a half old, I thought I'd offer up my review of the raid. So Nighthold, in terms of the storyline, Legion has three main parts. We're first of all going to be pushing back the Legion in terms of its invasion on the Broken Shore. Then we're going to actually go on the attack and seal up its entry point, again on the Broken Shore there. And finally, we're going to actually go on the attack, presumably with Illidan's Stormrage leading that. But Nighthold represents the last part in the pushing the Legion back. Suramar City is the last bastion of the Legion. It's where they set up their main base in terms of their stronghold. And this raid represents us kicking out their chief lieutenants from there, both in terms of the Legion commanders as well as the collaborators on the part of the elves of Suramar. Now, although Nighthold is the third raid of Legion, it's the first real tier raid with set bonuses and, well, exciting trinkets that we've come to expect from these in past years. As such, we were hoping for a step up in quality of encounter design as well as aesthetics. So in terms of looks, there is a very nice variation of environments from the sewer type beginning, potentially intended to be in keeping with our entry into the Black Temple nearly 10 years ago, to the splendour of Suramar itself that we're already familiar with, to the Eye of Eternity-esque lair of the Star Augur. The design looks and feels very nice without seeming too samey for me personally, though it does lack the visual wow factor that came with some parts of the Emerald Nightmare, in particular the Cenarius area. As raiders though, what we really want are fun and varied encounters. When it came down to it, all of the previous 10 bosses had essentially been, from my point of view anyway, single target fights in various guises. As such, they were pretty limited. Even though a number of encounters were still fun, in Nighthold we appear to have a much better mix of pure single target with occasional cleave, regular cleave and full-on cleave or AoE fights. Up until the release of Nighthold, Blizzard have released a lot of instant raid bosses over the years, and so it must become increasingly difficult to implement genuinely new mechanics without ending up with off-the-wall encounters like Dark Animus. However, I think we've seen a few new and interesting mechanics in Nighthold, and certainly some fights that feel very different to those that have come before them, including the time effects on Chromatic Anomaly and Alessander, to the extra action button buffs we get for Gul'dan. So in terms of some notable fights and my thoughts on them, Scorpion is a pretty good first boss. It's not especially difficult, requiring only the minimum of coordination, but you'll still wipe if you don't adhere to a few raiding basics. The Shockwave ability means you can easily end up pulling lots of extra mobs into the fight. Many raiding groups have done this deliberately to pad the meters, but for a group who are more likely to do it accidentally, it can lead to things getting out of hand and a number of deaths. In addition, the Glare is a pretty straightforward instant death mechanic if you're not focused. After Scorpion, we have Chromatic Anomaly and Trilliax, and at that point, the raid stops being linear. What we've been used to in recent years is a bit of a choice in the order that you do certain bosses. We had this through Warlords of Draenor to a certain extent. We've certainly had it in Emerald Nightmare once you've done the first boss. The next 5 are completely open to you, and then you have the last 2 that have to be done in a set order as well. We sort of have the same thing here. We have 3 bosses that we will do in order, very linear. After that, the next few bosses can be done in any order. There's no strict order. There's not necessarily even an obvious order other than the difficulty of the bosses if you're progressing through them. And then you finish up with 2 bosses again that have to be the last 2 bosses because they are the most difficult. And in terms of storyline, they are the key players. The penultimate boss, Elisand, who's the leader of the Elves of Suramar. And then, of course, we have Gul'dan, who is, in terms of the story at the moment, the Legion's main lieutenant on the Broken Isles. Now, in terms of normal and heroic, the raid gets a little trickier after the 3rd boss when you do any of the optional bosses, Aluriel being the first one you would come across, although you don't necessarily have to do it. This is also reflected in Mythic. There are, well, hundreds of guilds at the moment I'm doing this that have killed the first 3 bosses on Mythic. Not very many at all have killed the 4th. And it doesn't even matter what that 4th is, whether it's Aluriel or whether it's Crossus. The raids do start to get trickier at all levels at these bosses. Not necessarily because the mechanics are particularly tricky, certainly at the normal and heroic level. They are fairly easy to deal with and nothing changes much as the fight goes on. It's more that you'll need to keep an eye on events rather than simply reacting. For example, on Crossus, well, after all, if you fall into the drink after the boss smashes the bridge, there's not a lot you can do to react at that point. There are also some interesting decisions to be made in terms of the cleave and single target focus. There are a number of fights where you might think to yourself, there is some cleave required, we need to get some adds down. Tichondrius is a great example of this, and you want some of your raid geared up to deal with that. But it's no good if the whole raid is geared up for it. You don't need the whole raid to deal with the AoE. You also need to beat the boss as quickly as possible, and that is a pure single target aspect. So it's one of these things where you'll sort of want to decide within your raid group who are the classes who are going to be best at the cleave, who are the classes going to be best at single target, and that they talent for those without an eye on logs, because of course we all know that if you are focusing mostly on how you're going to pass, then you may not be doing the best for the fight. It very much brings into mind Beastlord Darmak in Blackrock Foundry and Walls of Draenor as a classic case of a fight where a lot of guilds, mine included at the time, took far longer to kill it than they should have done, because people were trying to maximise their overall damage instead of the effective damage. Another interesting feature of a number of the fights is the coordination that may have to be done on the fly in these fights. It's one thing to come up with a strategy and to follow that, and if everyone does what they should do, then the boss should die. But there are a few fights where you might actually need to react on the fly and change something. Elisand is a great example of this. At what point, you go through your priority in terms of the adds. At what point do you say, okay, forget about all that now and focus on the boss? Because there are 3 times in the fight when, you need to get it down and it'll sort of move into the next phase. Well, with the 3rd time being the moving into the point where you've actually finished the fight. Things like that can be quite useful as well as changing conditions as well, especially when, with Elisand, it is a really good fight. You can tell this is going to be a real tough one for the guilds that are working on that at the moment and the ones that eventually do it, because as the fight goes on, you've got the same mechanics to deal with, but you've got more coming in as well, and the interplay of those makes it much more complicated and much more brutal. Another really good feature of an effective raid encounter, and you don't need these all the way through the raid, are the ones where people have to be able to think for themselves, act within the main tactics, but also to be able to deal with mechanics without having to be told to. So you can definitely see where there will be some real roadblocks of fights as we get in, not just because some people might not have the gear or the artifact power to be able to produce the output, because that's another key feature. You might look at some guilds and they've got players with reasonable gear because they've been farming Emerald Nightmare Mythic and Trials of Valor Mythic, but have they got their artifact power up to the point where their overall output is significantly higher? You look at a guild where they might have an average of artifact power 40 and another one where it might be artifact power 50. Well, the one with artifact power 50 has got straight up 5% more output. That's going to count in those tight DPS checks or those really close situations where you're going to move from one phase to another. And then Gul'dan, again, another extra layer of accountability there, because you've got your extra action button for the first couple of phases, gives you a buff. With the DPS in particular, you're going to be able to use this. You want to use it as much as possible. At the same time, like with any buff, you want to try and line it up with your own cooldowns. You've got this thing where the buff doesn't just automatically last for a certain amount of time. If you take fire damage, and there's plenty of fire damage on this fight, it cancels automatically. How annoying is it when you use this thing and then a second later you get hit by fire? It's like, oh shit. And again, it's this thing where you'll have to actually plan your use of it very carefully, have to be aware of it. You don't want to wait too long because then you lose a whole application of it. At the same time, if you try and use it too eagerly, if you're straight away using it off cooldown, you're not really paying attention to whereabouts in the fight you are, you're going to be losing the effects of it because, you're going to be hit by fire and it's straight away gone. Gul'dan is also another classic fight where you've got this situation where you've got adds that need to be dealt with straight away. They may not be ideal. Some people might think, well, I'm not the best at dealing with those adds, but absolutely everyone needs to beast those down as soon as possible. Otherwise, yet again, things get out of hand. Great deal of coordination required on the fight, even on normal mode, never mind heroic, and goodness knows what Mythic's going to be like. So you can see in this raid fight, you've got a huge step up from the very, very easy boss at the beginning all the way through to what are almost certainly going to be the toughest fights that there have been. I'm not sure how it will scale necessarily, or compare, I should say, with the first version of Mythic Hellier, but certainly they look to be very, very brutal fights that are going to take more than just one reset for even the top guilds to clear on Mythic, and you can definitely see where there's going to be some serious roadblocks to everyone's progress as they go through this raid. In terms of the trinkets, we've probably for the first time now got a series of trinkets from the raids that for most classes will be better than the things we're trying to flog our guts for in dungeons. I wouldn't say necessarily brilliant. It could still be argued that a lot of the trinkets for a lot of the classes are going to be better for us from the raids than the dungeons by virtue of the fact it's easier to get them at a high enough item level. But for some classes they are very, very powerful indeed. Trinkets like the Convergence of Fates that actually affect our cooldowns are of course the sort of thing that we haven't had so far in the game in Legion, and it is the sort of thing we do expect from trinkets from the major raid bosses in a tier. We've also got the tier armor bonuses, which are now causing people to decide, oh, is it worth taking this piece? Do I have to change legendaries to be able to use this? We've of course got 6 pieces to that, so you can still wear your 2 bis legendaries and still get 4 set if it's going to be useful to you. But there is this thing that has existed a little bit. There have been a couple of 2 set bonuses so far from a couple of the dungeons in Legion. But in terms of the normal tier gear, this is the first time we might have had to think, okay, this piece isn't great itemized and it's a bit lower item level than what I'm wearing, but the set bonus might well be worth wearing it. And again, you need to sort of decide that for yourself. All in all, I would say Nighthold is shaping up to be a very good raid. You can definitely see where there's going to be challenge at various levels, depending on what level is your main progress of choice. It looks visually nice. There's a lot of variation with the bosses. The storyline seems pretty nice and it all seems to make sense, which has not always been the case with raid tiers. The actual narrations you hear as you come to some bosses are very helpful in terms of storyline as well. All too often, I think in the past, you've maybe had a few bosses where you sort of think, oh, okay, I know who this person is in terms of solo quests you might have done, but there's any number of nameless ones. You don't really know what's going on. I think the narration helps with that. It's sort of giving you a reason for killing this boss and going to this boss before moving to the next one, instead of just feeling like you're just moving from A to B to C like you're on some giant orienteering exercise. So those are my views on Nighthold. I hope you're enjoying it as well, especially as, you know, there is something for all of the difficulties out now. We've got an LFR out. Obviously, we've had normal and heroic out for a couple of weeks, and we've had mythic open as well. So everyone should have been able to experience some part of it if they wanted to. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm hoping that I'm going to be enjoying it for the next few months as well, and I hope you are too. I hope you found this interesting as always. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. And until next time, I'll see you later.